The following discussion is not necessarily the views of all involved. The goal is to start open and honest discussion in the Christian worldview. Like all things, weigh what you hear with what you know and join us in our pursuit for the truth. Enjoy the podcast.
If you can find the name of the demon, you can control it and send it back to hell.
Problem in the Bible is you. I'm sowing strife among brothers, and I'm so sorry.
I'll hit you. I'm not angry because I've been told not to be angry, but I'll hit you.
I got another idea, but I don't want to say it on the podcast because it's dangerous.
I think it's a polemic in itself that the Bible's not more sexual than it is.
You're demon possessed.
Well, maybe. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Second Rate Saints podcast. We're starting our creation series. I am your producer, Caleb. To my left is...
I'm Joel, and to my left is...
Colton, and to my left...
Josh, I'm drinking hot chocolate. To my left is Caleb.
Who's drinking tea. Nice. That's very good. Thank you, Josh.
You're introducing something.
I am introducing Joel. Do you read? Wait a second. No, Josh, could you introduce it?
Yeah, sure. Joel, do you read?
I'd prefer if Colton introduced it, actually.
Joel, do you read?
I do read, actually. This has been a wonderful intro. Yes, I am going to go through the segment we have called What Have You Read? Or Have You Done a Read? Or Name Pending. But what I've read is a book called With the Clouds of Heaven, which is a biblical theology on Daniel. From the New Studies in Biblical Theology series, which is edited by D.A. Carson, and I can't remember the guy who actually writes the book.
It's James M. Hamilton, correct?
Oh, it is Hamilton, yeah, for sure. He does a couple of them, actually, doesn't he?
He's a big biblical theologian.
He's a big name for biblical theology. Yeah, so I ended up reading through With the Clouds of Heaven for a paper that I was writing, and it was really intense. If you've done any kind of study on Daniel, it's one of the more complicated of the prophets, I would say, because it doesn't just deal with the history, it deals with genre, it deals with interpretation, it has so many poetic structures in it that you have to understand, and they're layered so perfectly on one another. But I would say one of the things that I, got out of it, if you look at Daniel, and we'll get into some poetic structure as we do our creation episode, right? Because if we're going to be talking about Genesis 1 and 2, some stuff's going to show up. So, stuff like a chiasm, there's a single chiasm that goes through the entire book of Daniel. And what a chiasm is, it's kind of like the way we rhyme like stanzas, right? Where it's like A, B, A, B, and it's like, roses are red, violets are blue, or whatever like that, right? But instead of rhyming, they'll have thematic ties, and they order it so that the central line of the stanza, if you were going to say it like that, if you're familiar with like 10th grade poetry, you look at the stanza and the very center line is the highest point of emphasis, right? And the highest point of emphasis in Daniel is actually two of the stories chapter 4 and chapter 5, I believe it is. And the way that they parallel each other is it's being saved. Oh no, it's not being saved from the fire furnace. It's the Nebuchadnezzar being driven out into the wilderness, and then it's Belshazzar having his temple attacked. Not his temple, his palace attacked. Well, he's using the golden dishes from the temple that he ransacked in Jerusalem.
The yectel tectel, you've been weighed and found wanting.
Yeah, so the writing on the wall, it's that story, right? And those two stories actually pair with each other in the chiasm.
Interesting.
Being like the center two lines, right? If you were to look at the entire book as a chiasm, from 1 to 7, and then you keep on doing it's like 1 to 7, 2 to 6, and then 4 and 5, right?
Like an arrow point.
It's like an arrow point, and what it points to is God controlling the rising and fall of kings, right? And then even when you get later on in the book, when it's talking about the 4 beasts, which are closely tied to the Maccabean revolt, right? It's weird foreshadowing, and I don't even think we have enough time in this podcast without dedicating an entire podcast to Daniel.
There's so many. I wrote a paper on Daniel, just a light introductory paper, right? Like very small, and started to go into the literature, and it's very complicated, very fast, with a lot of different opinions. What little bit of James M. Hamilton that I've read in other places, he seems like a very capable scholar for handling complex topics. how's his writing on this? Is
it comprehensible?
Is it a introductory work, intermediate work?
I don't think it's introductory.
Okay.
And maybe that's a mistake to bring that up as the source that you're going to suggest to people. But if you want a truly in-depth understanding of what Daniel is, and I don't think you can do it another way. I'm not interested in going in and just reading about the fiery furnace and like how that means we can be good Christians today. Like, that's wonderful, but I don't think that's the exact purpose of Daniel, right? Because God brings in 3 separate kingdoms to judge Israel. And all of them fall by God's hand, not by Israel's hand. It's similar to the other week we were talking about how the Ark of the Covenant brought itself back in 1st and 2nd Samuel, or 1 Samuel, like 5 or whatever it was, right? It's just showing God's sovereignty as independent from his people, but also working on behalf of his people.
Interesting.
Right?
Well, and with your point about we can't take the fiery furnace as if we stay good, we'll be fine. Yeah. It's the angel inside keeps them alive through the fire, the same way that God keeps Israel alive through the fire of the kingdoms, destroying everything around them. Yeah. And so it's like the message isn't, like you're saying, this like idea of like, hey, if we stay good with God, he's going to keep us through the thing. It's like, no, he's going to keep you through it because that's what he does. You're his people.
But even in before they get cast in, why can't I think of their names?
My shack, your shack, and in the bungalow.
Yeah. Shack, Shady Shark, and into bed you go is the way I remembered it.
No, Rack, Shack, and Betty.
Yeah.
That's a good
Rack, Shack, and Betty.
Before they get sent in, they're like, hey, even if God doesn't save us, it doesn't mean that A, he's not capable, or B, he doesn't exist. It
just means he didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as little transition point here, as Joel mentioned that we can read the text about how that's, hey, you should be good Christians, faithful to God, and he may protect you through the fires and trials of life, but that means a whole lot more in its original context. And when you study that text to its full depth, you begin to see a lot more meaning than just that first cursory glance over.
And it starts to explain things that were initially a huge issue. Right? Like, as I was reading through it when I was younger or whatever, right? Or maybe before I came to college, is maybe a better way to put it. It kind of bugged me that it was out of order chronologically. Like, if you're reading it, it's like, oh, Cyrus is king now? Oh, not the next one. It's Nebuchadnezzar. And if you have any grasp on, history or the March of Empires, you're going to be like, oh, so this is just a bunch of random stories thrown together in a nonchalant way, and it's whatever, and it talks about how good God is, and then we're done. It's like, no, it's building a theological point, right? And it's combining stories in a very intentional way.
Right.
Even to the point where it's 2 different languages as it's put together, right? Because there are sections of Daniel that are meant for the Hebrews and some that are meant for the Babylonians, right? So it's Aramaic. The beginning. It's in Aramaic, right? So in the beginning of the book, it's in Aramaic, and at the end. And that kind of creates a chiasm of the actual, not just the subject matter, but the language. I don't really know how else to say that. Okay. And then there's the thing is, like I said, it's layered. So there are some poetic devices that seemingly don't have anything to do with each other, and he overlays. There's another one called progressive parallelism, and you might get confused as you're reading it because it's 1 to 7 is a very obvious chiasm. But then as we get into like the visions, it starts to escalate more and use what's called progressive parallelism, which is where it creates, I don't want to call it a typology because we don't have time to talk about what a typology is, but it's a subject matter that gets increasingly more prevalent until it becomes the main focus of the story.
Mainly themes, right?
The main themes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the most English translations split up Daniel into 12 parts. Okay. But if you use the actual, the dividing of the scripture in Daniel itself, it's actually 10 parts.
Okay.
And the way that it's separated, because he uses the exact same phrase for multiple different instances of this, is every time he says, who is king, or that someone is king, or that a king did something, right? So it always has to do with kingship. That the reason the story is about to progress is because it's, in the third year of Jehoiakim, or whatever it is, the first king, or in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, or whatever. Every single time it's actually signaling a new story. And what's interesting about this is once it comes to the 12th chapter, it talks about Michael reigning as prince, which is super weird, because it's now no longer an earthly king, but it's something else, and that's of course paired with the Son of Man image as being made something of a king. It's really too complicated. Right. I'm sorry that I chose it, but it is a very interesting book.
Yeah, and this progressive parallelism kind of thing, where it's building this theme slowly through the thing, so when it gets to this point, it becomes really important for the overall theme of, especially like you're saying, the last two chapters or last few chapters, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or everything after 7, which I guess is more than a few, but
yeah, and to be specific, that progressive parallelism is kingship.
Okay,
that's what he's talking about.
Right, and so when it gets into the Son of Man stuff and Michael reigning as prince, it means something really important to the actual.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the
overall structure,
Nebuchadnezzar, it's like he's just a guy. He thinks he's a son of God, but he's not, right? He is the lowest of the kings. Actually, you would say the lowest of the kings could even be the king that was reigning when the Israelites were taken into exile, right? So that is the lowest king, and then it swells up to the point where now it is God's kingdom, and that everything belongs to him. So it is about the sovereignty of God. And you're going to see a couple of these weird poetic devices or whatever, and we're going to talk about it more because it really works for our, I guess, hermeneutic methodology. Is that the right way to say it?
Well, so as you mentioned, like when you were, if I can assist at least.
Yeah, go for it.
When you read Daniel, you're like, hey, this is all out of order. Mm-hmm. What is going on? Is this just a hodgepodge of stories that has like a kind of a common theme? Is there like an actual undergirding as you called progressive parallelism? Is there chiasms? Is there more going on? And so that same problem and answer, or at least attempt to answer, can be applied to Genesis 1-3.
Yeah.
Because if
can I say one last thing about Daniel before we start? I'm so sorry.
I know you want to. I can see it in your eyes.
Yeah,
of course.
No, I really want to. And it's not even like a theological thing. Okay. It might be a little bit theological, but when I believe it's Gabriel that's talking to Daniel, and Daniel just falls on his face. Yeah. And he doesn't get up.
Help this man get up.
Right? Like, yeah. And then the angel's like, hey, get up. Like, get up and look at the vision. And like you see some of that happening in Revelation 2, where he begins to worship the beast and then is told not to, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, what is the human response? It's the reason why I think Daniel wrote it himself, is because what is the human response to divinity or to something supernatural like that? And it's to fall on your face and not know what to do with yourself, right? And I think that's a really cool, very human response.
Is it Isaiah or Ezekiel that says, I'm undone?
Isaiah says, woe is me, for I am undone. Okay. Because he sees God.
Right.
He sees God face to face.
Yeah, and it's that like, further paralleling your idea that it's fall on your face and
and that might be why prostrating oneself is an act of worship.
Yep. Yeah, and so a lot of those same hermeneutical issues that you just brought up in your kind of endeavors in Daniel can be applied to Genesis 1-3, because there even a cursory reading will arrive at some problems that may come up, inconsistencies.
Are you saying there's
even
problems in the Bible, Caleb?
Well, it depends what you're approaching it. What are you expecting from it?
The problem in the Bible is you.
You know what? Actually, yes.
Both theologically and in interpretation. Like right out of the gate, the order of events. So in Genesis 1, you have creation of, so there's first water, the cosmic waters.
Right.
Then he makes land, then plants, animals, followed through with the days, and then finally culminating in humanity on the 6th day as the pinnacle of creation.
Right.
Right? In the second account, there is first land, but it's like arid, not filled. Before there was no bush of the tree, no bush in the field, no whatever in the, I can't remember the thing right now. Arid.
Is this chapter
land.
2?
This is 2 now. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, 2. This would be 2:5.
5, yeah. Or 4.
5.
I choose 4.
I know you're wrong.
No,
It's an arid land with just mist, but it starts with land. Then human male is made. Then followed by plants, animals, and then finally woman.
right.
And so that like even the order is different there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Especially given that the first chapter in a little bit gives a very different approach to how creation is structured.
Yeah. Well, it gives a very structured approach.
Yeah.
6 in at least the at least in its cursory reading, 6 literal days.
Yeah.
And you can debate.
Cursory reading, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's why I said cursory reading. Man, I'm sorry.
We're not saying you should curse while you read.
As long as you laugh, it wasn't demeaning.
Yeah, the reason we bring it up is that it's a very interesting topic, the first few chapters of the Bible, because we're talking about things like, even with Daniel, but just structure and literary devices and all that. But very few people actually agree on how the structure of Genesis is.
Yeah.
Like what it means.
There's a massive shift in style as well. Like as you were mentioning, there's a particular structure in Genesis 1, and then the structure changes.
Yeah.
There's a numerical
As if it's telling a different order of events.
Exactly.
Which doesn't make sense. Normally.
If you a cursory reading.
Yeah.
That would be what you'd come to. There's also like even God's name is different. Just generic Elohim, God, is used in the first, but his covenantal name, Yahweh Elohim.
Tetragrammaton.
Yes.
Such an awesome word.
Is used in the second, which again isn't a massive difference, but that difference exists and is a stark difference.
In theme and meaning, right?
Well, it's a significant difference because Elohim was also just a word you could use for like other deities.
Yep.
Whereas Yahweh was
Right.
like he gave that to Moses as a sign that the
The
Israelites
Lord.
would know who he was.
Yeah.
As part of the plans for the covenant, it's personal, it's identity written.
Elohim is his title. Yahweh is his name.
Yeah.
Right. The I am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also just a shift in focus. The first account, or what we might call the weak account, is focused on God's interaction with the cosmos as a whole.
Yep.
And greatly emphasizes his transcendence from it.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Whereas the second,
The strong account, right?
What's that?
You have the weak account and the strong account?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
No,
Your reading's getting more and more cursory.
that's what I'm good at.
And then the Edenic account, you're having, it's far more personable. God forms, plants, creates. What's
yeah.
that?
Oh, no, I was just going to add to that. The first one is also theocentric. It's all about God doing things, God's position, God's greatness, God speaking, like all those things. Yes, creation is being made, but it's as if everything is coming from him. Whereas the second story is the orientation seems to be on creation and the human.
Yeah.
Humans.
No, there's a structural shift, a tonal shift, an order of events shift.
There's also another interesting the mechanism of creation is different. In the first story, he creates by speaking. In the second story, he creates by interacting, manipulating, and altering, like forming the human. He doesn't speak them into existence. He the plants sprout out from the ground, but he doesn't say anything. He just
It just says he causes.
He does it, yeah.
Yeah.
and he brings forth living animals. He doesn't.
It says he
let there be
forms them.
animals. Yes.
Yeah, like he did.
Yeah.
Humanity.
Just so that we cover all of our bases with creation, because it's a very interesting topic and one that, again, people disagree with a lot. How do we know that? Why are we saying that there's two different accounts? Why are we saying that there's one and then another?
Well, that's
Not
why
to
we're
get
listing the
too
differences.
far into it, but
That's why we're going into cursory reading. There's problems between 1-4 and 2-4 to 324. 324. There's a tonal shift, there's an order shift, there's a structure shift.
And 2.5 starts retelling how creation existed, right?
Yeah. I actually have a theory about 2.4 that we'll get into when we're going through different ways to read these two stories, which will be shortly. Because traditionally, again, if you were to just pick up a Bible and you were going to read it, as anyone who's read most history works or literature in most things, if there's going to be a massive shift, there's a heading that tells you that. There's no heading that tells you that in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so the natural and most common interpretation and approach to this in layman, and has been in layman across the last 2,000 years, has been, these are chronological order. Like these two stories fit together. They're just different perspectives. And so now,
or at least like we've mentioned that there is a tonal shift or a structural shift, and it might just be that the after 2.4, it's focusing and zooming in on something.
So you wanted to talk, Josh. You listed that there's this idea of positive differences. Yes. And negative differences. Now, we've probably listed some of them already.
You've listed all the positive differences.
What do you mean by...
So, like there's differences structurally between these two pieces of text about creation, but that doesn't mean they're different stories. It just means that they're written differently. The same way that, like, if you were reading Daniel, you would notice, this section's Aramaic, the other sections are Hebrew, but it's all one story.
Right.
So but with Genesis, we've listed the positive differences. These things that are, you reading them, you notice there's a difference, but it doesn't mean that they're different stories.
Would the changing of events, though, wouldn't that be like the order of events? That's a negative difference.
Yeah. So, and there are three major negative differences, inconsistencies between these two seemingly.
At this point, we're just establishing that, is there a difference? What's going on?
And so the first one is Genesis 1 states that trees are made on the day 3.
Okay.
And then humans and animals are made on day 6.
Yeah.
Genesis 2, 4 to 3:25, 24, however, says that humans are made and the trees and bushes have not yet appeared, and the garden is made after humanity. And so you've got there's no trees.
An obvious discrepancy.
Yeah. And it's obvious, but only if you've read it 47 times. Like it's one of those things where it's like
when you're thinking about it, you can see how that's not what the previous thing said.
Yeah.
A specific point on that, and why that point is very, why that point sticks.
Yeah.
Genesis 2:19, where God makes the animals, forms the animals. The Hebrew there could be translated as pluperfect, meaning had formed. That's several.
A past completed action.
Yeah. And the Hebrew there does support that. It can technically happen.
Yeah.
The issue, the reason why, there's a bunch of issues with that Hebrew-wise. Actually,
right.
If you really want to...
with most differences in interpretation.
Yeah, well, it's not just like it can work.
Yeah.
But because it can work in both senses, in that he fashioned present tense, like he's doing it at that time.
Yeah.
And then he past tense completed action had formed, and then it's not a reference to a discrepancy in days. It just mentions that he had previously formed them. Now he forms man on the 6th day. It technically can work in Hebrew. It's just all the scholars debate about the likelihood. The majority of scholars who are actual let's say Bible translators and Hebrew scholars will go, this is not an instance of pluperfect.
Right.
However, more, let's say, Bibles that are designed for more of a idea orientation to smooth out issues between the reader and whatnot, they will often say had formed, which is just one instance, let's say, with the NIV where a preference and interpretation has taken place,
right,
that is maybe not entirely justifiable. That's one of the reasons why we read multiple translations. But the reason why this is super important for why that could be the case, but why Josh's point with the plants matter, is because the same cannot be said for the plants.
Right.
Yes.
The
It's
argument,
not in a pluperfect.
the argument
Yeah.
can be made about the animals. Sure.
Yeah.
Still leaves a massive problem for the plant.
Yes. And then that gets to the second one, which is the animals, which is Genesis 1 states that animals are made on day 6, and then humans are both made at the same time after the animals.
Yep.
But Genesis 2 states that Adam is made first,
Yep.
then the plants, then all the animals, including the birds and the fish, which were made on the day 5.
Which, even if they were made before, like what we just talked about with Caleb, that still doesn't explain the plants. It
Yeah.
doesn't explain the other stuff, too.
Exactly. And so you've got now there's a series of events here, right? It's not just the human and then the plants are made, then the human and then the animals are made. It's the second one is the humans are made in Genesis 2, then all the animals, and then God commands him to name all the animals.
Yep.
And we could get into numbers. Between total species, there's 3.2 million across all Earth.
That we know of.
Yeah. And then with a potential of up to 8 million.
Unless you add the
undiscovered.
dinosaurs.
Those are included. And then you've got what if you reduce it to just mammals? You've got 18,000. Okay. So he has to name. Sorry, I forgot the other part. After he names them all, God makes Eve.
Yeah.
But Adam and Eve are both made on day 6.
Because he didn't find a perfect
Yeah.
partner for himself. So
Yeah.
he made one out of Adam.
So Adam, he's been alive for 5 seconds and has to come up with 18,000 words minimum to name all these animals. And then God puts him to sleep, wakes him up. There's a woman.
There's ways to temper that.
Yeah. But that's the point of the 18,000. The like,
There's a
let's
progression
rein it
of
in.
time.
Yeah.
It's an odd, interesting.
Yeah.
I think this goes more to a point that we haven't quite made yet.
And then
Interpretation.
there's the third. God states that birds are made on day 5, then animals and humans on day 6. But Genesis 2 states that God makes animals, birds, and humanity on the same day.
Right. With humans being the pinnacle of creation in chapter 1. At
Yeah.
the very end of that day.
Yeah. Whereas in Genesis 2, it's one at the beginning, one at the end, and the animals in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the positive, the negative. We've presented that there's a problem here. There's 4 different ways. Oh, what
I
were
was
you
just
going
going
to
to
say?
say, is this the disclaimer part of the podcast?
This should be the disclaimer
We
part of the
have
podcast.
talked about Genesis in a way I would argue everyone can agree on at this point.
Oh, yeah.
And now we're kind of venturing into the wilderness a little bit. and as we go forward, I hope that whatever we say, whether right or wrong, would help somebody understand something about either what they believe or what Genesis says.
And that being said, just like how we're saying, I mentioned that like you read this 47 times and then you come across these differences. It could be that after I read it 47 more times that I'll go back and go, oh, these aren't actually problems at all. Or there might be biblical scholarship that looks into this further and then goes, oh, there might be theological reasons for this and whatever.
Well,
Yes, that could be.
Yeah.
But I won't.
I'm not putting bets on it.
No, I'm not. Like, I'm not saying that I can't be wrong, but I'm not saying I'm not confident.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
But I should say, everyone, this is a hot topic in the Christian world. If you disagree with us, or if you have a comment or another angle or anything, just let us know. Let us dialogue about it.
It's interesting because I think all 4 of us have slightly differing opinions on what Genesis 1 to 11 in general, but 1 to 3 specifically, what we're talking about today, what it all means, how to interpret it properly, because it is something that is very heavily debated. Like you said, it's a very controversial topic. Not controversial as in bad, but controversial as in very interesting to talk about, but everyone disagrees. I think it's fair to say that we don't think that we're right on everything, but we're going with the best knowledge that we have.
I think I'm right on everything.
Except for Joel.
Disclaimer, I'm right.
And I will point out that I have friends and family that would go to the extent of like, hey, if you disagree with me on this, you're not a Christian.
Oh, I have ones that go way further than that, yeah.
How?
Like,
You're demon possessed.
well, maybe, but
Anyway, don't give me those eyes, Joel. And just so I think all four of us here are, the claims about Genesis 1-3 are not, by and large, are not salvational issues.
yes.
Yeah, there's things that you can get wrong. There's things that you can get
really
very wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we're not going to go around here going, well, you know what, Colton?
Jesus doesn't exist because the Genesis one. No, of course not.
Because he wasn't created during creation. It's like, that's a bad
And
take.
so I'd like to ask the audience to extend the same amount of courtesy that we are extending, hopefully, to each other and to you, that, hey, this is, we're doing our best to try to understand the Word of God with the tools that we have. Help me understand if you have something.
Yeah, and like what we said, that we're not fully sure. There is markers and opinions that have been thought out for the last 3,500 years on this stuff, that there is some weight in certain categories that you can go, oh, we're pretty sure about this. Or there are certain things that we can be pretty, like, confident on. But, of course, everyone's still going to disagree. And the point shouldn't be to get mad. Like, don't get mad at people that have different opinions.
Don't tell me what
Colton's
to do.
telling us not to get mad at him.
Yeah, don't get mad at me.
So,
I have all the bad opinions, so, yeah.
all that said, what do we think about serpent seed? I'm kidding. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so this is a classic example of adding confusion.
I'm sowing strife among brothers, and I'm so sorry.
Gone.
We don't want to add confusion. We actually want to try to promote
Yes.
healthy conversation and
Learning.
hopefully illumination to an approach to the text.
So now that we've had our disclaimer, thank you for reminding me, Joel.
But serpent seed.
Serpent seed.
I'll hit you. I'm not angry because I've been told not to be angry, but I'll hit you. I've done my best to try to categorize and then put it in our notes that we have in front of us here. There's 4 different approaches to this problem.
What problem is
I would
that?
argue there's more than
The problem we just listed. The discrepancies.
The discrepancies, yeah.
What did you say there, Joel?
I mean, there's more than. Never mind. I just said there's more than 4, but then I realized it was making more confusion.
Well, there's 4 mainstream and recognizable
Well, there's
ones.
4 categories of
Oh,
thought,
yeah. Okay.
and we're about to get into that. Yeah.
The right ones and the wrong ones.
What about the other 2?
The wronger ones. I don't know.
Ambiguous and confusing are the other 2
Hey,
categories.
we're gonna have to.
Let's go over
this
the
is
categories.
bad.
Bad segment.
Okay, the transition point. Disclaimer, now we're going to talk about the 4 different categories in which people often will slide into when they're approaching these differences. There's the traditional chronological approach, in which, hey, these stories do match. They're different angles, but they fit together.
Right.
That is the common...
What do you mean by fit together? Like, time-wise they fit together, or like there is no contradiction between them and that's all it says?
So, like, counting.
I don't know how helpful that is.
No, I'm sorry. I just immediately came with the singer. I'm so sorry.
Because these 4 categories of why there seems to be discrepancies in these chapters, I've heard before, but I don't actually know it super well. Caleb, what does it mean by chronology? Like the chronology is
Normally what will
compatible.
happen, it's that as Josh mentioned earlier, is that the second account provides a zoomed in view of the first. And so normally that it's like, hey, the accounts in Genesis 2 is a zoomed in or a more expanded narrative of the creation account of day 6. Normally with like saying, yeah, the creation of the plants and the animals.
Day 6 specific?
Yeah, and the plants and the animals are a quick summary. There's a quick little summary at the beginning there. And then the rest of the events on Genesis 2-3 are events on day 6 and 7.
Yeah.
That is normally the case. Those are the people in that camp will normally make the pluperfect argument. Yeah, which to be honest with you, again, the Hebrew stands up.
Yeah.
The likelihood of it is the problem.
Right.
However, as Josh noted out in that those negative differences, those 3 negative differences that he listed, they kind of rule out a chronological reading.
Right. And why is that?
Well, for one, the order is completely wrong.
Yep. It would say the same or similar order if it was written to be compatible with it, right?
Yeah, if it is a zoomed in version of the first, right, of a more like up close reading of it, it wouldn't give a separate order of events.
Okay.
What's the other two that you had there, Josh?
There's not enough time in the day.
Oh,
Yeah.
just like the generic
Yeah.
apologetic.
Also, like
I'm willing. If I'm honest with you, I'm actually pretty soft on that issue. I don't really care.
The timeline for me. Some people take a very hard stance on time in Genesis 1 and stuff like that. If you were to name 18,000 creatures uniquely right off the bat, it would take at least like 18,000 seconds or whatever. But it probably would take way more than that, which wouldn't fit into an exact day.
How many seconds are there in a day?
More than that.
But regardless, I'm like, you're right.
Yeah.
That is one there. It's not super convincing for me. I don't think that's a defeater for chronological, but you're right, it's there.
Yeah.
What was the third?
The third is another chronological issue, but it's the birds are in the wrong place. So they're
not in the sky.
Yeah, they're after humanity, even though they're on a day previous.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about chronology, we're talking about time, and this is a little bit of an issue for a lot of people, right? Especially those we'll call them like 7-day creationists, literal 7-day creationists, right?
Also,
and then
sometimes called young earthers.
There's young earthers, but that's more of a result of the presupposition of a literal 7 days, right? So what happens here is that because there's 7 days listed in creation, it has to be 7 literal days. And then there's this argument over yom, which is the Hebrew word for day. Yeah. And on both sides, I think they get it a little bit wrong, at least in my view. And you're going to kind of learn what I think about this. But if you guys can jump in as well. There's one side that says yom means 24 hours. It means a day. And then when it's talked about, it's a day. So there's a day of the Lord, or there's a day, whatever, right? And the other group is like, 1,000 years are like a day, so days don't really mean as much, which is a horrible misapplication of that verse. But the essence of it, which is that a day can just be a period of time, is an acceptable view, but it's also limiting, right? Because then it becomes these people who believe each day was a different era in history, right? Where like the Jurassic period was day 3 or whatever it was. And there's these ideas. And I feel like they're coming with a presupposition on the text. They already have something formed in their head, which is, again, this chronological order that they must stick to. And if you look at the way that I said Daniel was laid out, which is not chronologically, but rather for the purpose of a poetic structure that creates a main point.
Yeah.
Be creative with it a little bit more, You can apply more than one methodology and see if anything else comes up. It might just straight up not work, but I think it's going to work better than saying 1,000 years is like a day, because that's a misapplication.
It is. I was going to
I'm sorry for my rant. I was thinking you guys were going to hop in and argue with me, but
No, you're doing too good.
No, that's true. Yeah, an argument for Old Earth, saying that 1,000 years is like a day, is not the greatest argument against someone who's saying that you can't misinterpret the literal word of God in Genesis 1. It's literal, it's whatever. It's like, well, you're taking something later that was added later and reapplying it before, which it's not where it's supposed to go.
Also, in an attempt to appeal to plain reading, they're adding confusion. Like, they're doing the thing they don't want to do.
I think if you're going to take presuppositions before you read the text, you should take the presuppositions of the ancient Israelite.
Yeah.
And his whole cosmological world
How
view.
he perceives the world.
Which we'll get into, I think, when we get more into the...
maybe.
Well, yeah, that's what it's written for.
Yes.
What about the competitive view?
Yeah. So competitive view is the second It's normally held by more liberal scholars alongside with some kind of documentary hypothesis. This is something that I think both Joel and Josh have probably run into more so than Colton and I. That there's two, maybe three, although most people say four, source documents for the majority of the Old Testament. Oh, is it 5 now? But actually, documentary hypothesis is starting to fall out of favor in a lot of places. It propped up in like the early 90s, held sway, and it's kind of dwindling.
Remind me, what is documentary hypothesis?
It's based a lot on this section of scripture uses these words for God. It seems to have this theological viewpoint and emphasize these things. Therefore, it's probably from a different point in Israel's timeline, and someone has edited in a bunch of different religious histories and religious texts together to make a unified religious Israelite document. And so the alternative account is like, it holds that, hey, these are two alternate creation accounts for the Israelites.
Well, you even mentioned it earlier.
Sorry, that's competitive. Sorry, alternative is next. It's two competitive accounts where they're not meant to be read together. There's no through line, and they're actually meant to be one or the other. It's just the editor put them side by side because they're both existent within the, let's say, the mythological library of Israel's religious movement. I'm not super convinced by that, considering how, despite the list of differences, as we'll see, there's a lot of similarities.
Yes.
Does anybody else have anything to say about the competitive accounts?
The competitive count, I don't think this is going to sound super lame, but I just don't think it matches the way Scripture tends to unify itself.
Sure.
Super lame. No, I'm just kidding.
Like the pattern in Scripture is that these books are organized together to express theological truths together from a pattern that is progressed.
Oh, buddy, you're getting into the fourth way to read it.
Slow down. but I just mean outside of creation. Like Daniel, there was these different stories, but they worked together to produce this theme that is then paralleled and progressive parallelism, like you presented. And there are similarities between the stories, and so it seems like it's trying to make a point about creation together.
Yeah. And something we'll probably get into fairly shortly with some of the other hypotheses is the idea that there are a lot of thematic, especially in terms of numbers and such, connections between the original and how those themes carry over into the new, I say new, the second creation-ish account.
Well, we'll get there.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far.
The third, and I have a lot of respect for this one, personally, even though I don't necessarily hold it, alternative accounts. So this is here's an example of approaching it as alternative accounts. The first uses the ancient Near Eastern motif of creation from cosmic waters, whereas the second, the Enoch account, uses the motif of the earth, or another one. The first account is more about God's relationship to the cosmos as a whole, and the second is about God's relationship specifically with humanity.
Right.
And so they're not competitive accounts, but they're two separate accounts. This is the weakness in this one, where they're two separate accounts not to be read into one another, but just emphasizing different things.
Would this then mean that they're not talking about a creation account necessarily as it happened, but more it's just trying to get across thematic elements about the things within them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're not meant to. Then they don't read them into one another.
Right.
And I think I think doing so ignores the theological similarities and a lot of the theological similarities. And then does anybody else got anything about the alternative? We're going through those ones pretty fast.
I think a problem with the alternative is the theological similarities between the theological emphasis on the creation of humans.
Sure. Yeah.
Focusing on the
right
and the image of God in the first Genesis 1, and then also God breathing his life into the human. There's this interesting connection between God and the person, God and the people.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd connect it with the breathing of life personally. We'll get there. There's something there. I think it has more to do with him being the gardener, and which is presented almost as a priestly kingly role. But we'll get there.
Yeah,
that's a fun one.
Your favorite thing. I remember that. I've heard some of this already.
One of my issues I have with the alternative account is that wouldn't it matter a lot where you draw, because the point of the second creation account, quote unquote, from 2 all the way to the end of 3-ish, is the sin, devolvement into sin, how humanity falls, whereas the first creation account ends with perfection.
Yeah.
Which, thematically just it clashes with itself unless you draw a line somewhere else where people don't normally draw it.
Well, the idea is that they're two the issue with the alternative account, this is one of the things that bothers me too, even though I may sometimes more sympathize with this, is it presupposes that they cannot be reconcilable.
Right, it's perfectly indistinguished, or perfectly separate.
And that they are merely stories, and this is all they are merely stories to explain things about reality as separate. So they're not two sides of the same coin, they're just two different stories to emphasize things. And so the distinction between them is so hard. It's so cut and dry. And I don't think the text shows that it deserves that.
No.
Does this one rely heavily on other creation myths overlaid onto it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Are we talking about this?
Which we're going to get into. We'll get into that. That is coming up.
Question, because I was writing something in my notebook. Are we talking about the complementary view?
Not yet.
This is what's about to come.
Okay.
I am going to point out as to Colton's what he mentioned with the fall narrative in Genesis 3. The reason why, and this is actually a pet peeve of mine, where people will link Genesis 1 and 2 together.
Right.
And they'll be like, this is how the world began, and then the fall.
Right.
The reason why we link 3 and 2 together, apart from, its own periscope and there's no reason to cut it up. Yeah. It's a chiasm.
I was going to say, there's going to be, I've heard.
Like it's an explicit chiasm linking the two, centering the fall. Adam and Eve's decision to disobey God. Well, Eve's deceiving and Adam's act of disobedience.
So I hate to be that guy, but I hear a lot of people saying, again, this chiasm, this literary structure. How easy to read is this structure? Is it something that seems read onto the text? Or is it something that's pretty obviously there?
It's all over Hebrew scripture. Anybody
this specific part. Because that would be the disagreement, is people believe it's not a chiastic structure, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, but I haven't found anyone that knows the Hebrew that doesn't say that. So it's only people argument. Who only read English go, nah.
Well,
so this is the point that we've discussed. You bring it up. We discussed a lot. Colton brought it up. We discuss a lot about literary devices of the Hebrew people or the Aramaic people of the scripture. They're not, and we might be running up against it. The layperson might be reading, what's a chiasm, or what's a progressive parallelism, or all these other things. And the reason for that is because, like when you read Shakespeare, you have to learn the literary notes or the structures within it because it was written at a different time.
Imagine if you were trying to write Chinese poetry, they wouldn't use stanzas like we do or something like that. You have to learn what structures they use.
And so at different times and in different uses of literature, they have different notes that when you read them, like the example that I've used is when you read a receipt, right? You know how to read a receipt and you know how to read a science textbook. And when you read them, looking at it immediately, oh, these are not the same thing, and I know how to read them because I've learned how to read both. The person in the time that Genesis was written, reading the book, wouldn't have seen the numbers because they weren't there, and they wouldn't have seen the verse or chapter numbers. Because they had them structured, like you said, in their own pattern with these literary notes, like in Daniel with king. Every time it mentions a king or a ruler, they know that's
a new periscope.
Story. The same way that when I see a giant 3 on the fall, I know I'm on the next chapter.
Which aren't the same as how they structured it.
Yeah.
We drew these.
And so
after.
the chiasm is meant to show both the unified periscope that the fall narrative and the Edenic creation narrative are the same, but not just that, because as Joel explained what a chiasm is, it also shows the specific point, the emphasis of that one, which is their decision to, Adam's decision God. To disobey and Eve's deception. Yeah. So as you were pointing
which
out,
points them as being one whole creation narrative all the way to the end of the fall.
Yeah, and so that's just to your previous point. The last approach to this problem is what's called a complementarian accounts. Good if I just read what I have written there.
Sounds good to me.
The editor would have known of the tension between these two accounts and still felt it reasonable to present them side by side, because that's the document we have right now, right? And this is where I think that there's a genius in the author's genius is shown in 2.4. Actually, I got this idea
many different
from but this is to what we're talking about.
Okay,
I get this idea from Robin Rutledge. So 2.4 is that transition period between the first creation account and the second creation account, and oftentimes it's said that begins the second creation account.
Okay.
But here we go. Verse 4 contains these are the generations of, which is in Genesis the marker, like in Daniel when it's talking about kings. This is the marker this is a new periscope. So it introduces the periscope marker for Genesis, thus indicating this is a new periscope. It's a literary signal, blah, blah, blah. It also has the mirrored conclusion of these are the heavens and the earth. It reiterates the introductory sentence of the first creation account in 1.1. However, it also indicates an anticipatory reversal of that exact same statement in the day when the Lord God made earth and the heavens, indicating that this is again showing an anticipatory difference in a creation account that's about to come. So it reiterates the same in reverse
with a slight reversal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The verse 4 actually just straight up functions as a chiasm itself, both linking the previous document, reversing the two. Linking the two documents, introducing the periscope thing for Genesis, and yet by saying it as the heavens and the earth and the heavens, it acknowledges that there's a difference between these two accounts. Therefore, despite the seeming continuity, the author must have felt it reasonable to put these two things together, and he writes in verse 4, chapter 2, verse 4, to indicate, hey, these are two creation accounts. Specifically, and he thinks it's reasonable to put them together.
Interesting.
So then, what are they complementary? What do they put together? Then is the question, right? Because we've mentioned all the differences, but we've also hinted at there's a lot of similarities. Josh has already brought up, hey, there's man is made in the image of God, right? Mm-hmm. And he's given dominion over the earth. Well, another thing is, he's made as vice regent on earth, basically, in the garden.
Yep.
So God creates the animals, and he's like, hey, I invite you in to name them, which in that culture is a massive thing.
If you can name something, you have power over it.
Yeah, it shows that he is God invites him to have sovereignty on earth, and he gives him the garden to work in, to keep. Yeah.
And just so people know, they're like, why is that a thing? If you've ever read any fantasy stuff like that, you'll find this really weird note where, like, if you can find the name of the demon, you can control it and send it back to hell. Right? And it was this idea that the name was intrinsically linked to the individual, and if you could speak it, or
names have power even of themselves.
Yeah. And that comes from this very old idea in the ancient Near East was this idea. And so it's significant that as region over creation, God gets Adam, name them all.
Well, and it even becomes significant that God creates through speaking.
Yeah.
Right, like, and that's part of it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, now you are a sub-creator with me because you are now speaking over the animals I have created, in part creating their essence.
Yeah. And then you jump into the New Testament, he has the name above every other name. No one.
Yeah.
And we could go into many other references too, but this idea of naming also kind of means you have some power over it.
Well, yeah, but that's the linking of dominion over the earth in the first, and Adam's role is more fleshed out in the second, given more specificity.
And it gives a terrifying, and there's a terrifying moment in Genesis 3, but that's for another day.
Yeah.
You won't believe what happens next.
This gets more into what Joel. This gets more into what you and I have both discussed and read on. Genesis presenting as a quote-unquote cosmic temple.
Yeah.
That there's a pattern.
Yeah.
Especially when one knows, especially for a Israelite Jew who knows anything about the temple or anything about the tabernacle. Because if you start to parallel, lamppost, tree of life, what's here? Look. The creation of light. To work and to keep. Those are only listed. Those specific words are only listed. Of priests specifically in the sanctuary. Sanctuary. That's weird.
And
God's presence walks to and fro, mostly connected with his when he comes comes to the garden in Genesis 3. In the cool of the day, and his presence is there. His presence is walking to and fro in the sanctuary, in the Holy of Holies. What?
I don't want to burst the bubble or anything like that because I don't think I actually am going to. I just like a further explanation on this, but the temple wasn't created when Moses wrote this. Is it referencing the tabernacle or temple?
That's why I said temple and tabernacle at the beginning.
I didn't hear tabernacle. My bad.
And all of these things are presented actually first in the tabernacle and then carried over.
Well, let's talk about for a second, just to not derail. It's actually helping what you're saying. Just to derail you and ruin your day.
Ruin everything.
We talked about the documentary theory.
Yeah.
There's a couple of different sources for that, but it would explain some of the reasons why the temple, which is something that's seen later on in the Bible, not really later on because it's still in the Torah, but there's three that I'm thinking of right now: Yahwehistic, Elohistic, and Mosaic sources. And the most common understanding of Genesis, it's just what we've said for a long time, whether it's 100% true or not, is that Moses is the primary contributor to Genesis. And he's also the primary contributor to the building of the tabernacle. So he would have had knowledge of the structure and in some way saw the parallel himself. Although I think it's still mostly God behind it. Anyways, that's the reason for what you're saying, right? Am I right in saying that, or
are you talking to me or to...
Talking about you? You have the...
Okay.
You got the knowledge now.
All I'm presenting here at the moment, I'm not going to get into documentary hypothesis. All I'm presenting...
Yeah, that's a big topic.
All I'm presenting is that the Israelite who has... Let's say with Moses, right? They're building the tabernacle. He will hear the creation account, both of them, and go, wait a second, these are the same. There's some patterns here. So like, Adam is presented as a priest his working and keeping of the garden is only explicitly said for priests. There's an imagery with the tree of life and the lampstand, which we've mentioned before. The interior of the tabernacle and of the later temple is depicted with pomegranates and garden imagery. The whole...
Also at the gate, the cherubim are guardian creatures of the heavenly realm. So they're at the perimeter of God's presence.
Yeah, they're the ones guarding
the wall, the doorway with the fiery sword.
But also the ones on the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah, they're the ones guarding the Holy of Holies. Also, it's a three. Josh actually knows the term for this, but it's a ringed circle. There's three consecutive encompassing rings. At least you mentioned it before.
A cigarette.
No, I don't. I just know that throughout the biblical text, whenever you have the presence of God presented, there's usually like the temple, the tabernacle, the garden, and then also Jesus with Jairus' daughter. There's the three circles, three consecutive circles.
Yeah, three consecutive circles.
Yeah,
that go into one another. So there's we're getting there. There's the Holy of Holies, the utmost inner, God's presence itself. Then there's the holy place. Then there's the courtyard. Yep. Just so there's Eden, the garden, and the outer world.
Would be,
and that happens also with Jairus' daughter sorry, just because I don't want to get this confused. You said Eden, the garden, and then the wider world. The garden is in Eden. That's.
I think it's the garden, then Eden, and then the wider world.
You're right. I got my notes mixed up here. You're right.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
That same three consecutive areas of increasing importance.
Right.
There's also like when they start to look at they call it the eschatological temple, but let's say the heavenly temple, which is supposed to be the original copy of what the earthly tabernacle and temple is. That's said explicitly in several places throughout the biblical text. The heavenly temple is shown as rivers always coming out of it. And that's another key thing with connection between the temple and Eden.
There's four rivers in Eden that run through the garden.
There's one river that flows out, and then it splits into four. Not through, it actually comes out of the garden. G.K. Bailey goes over an entire 200 pages on this topic. John Walton goes over extensively on this. James M. Hamilton, who wrote the Daniel thing, also engages in this on a couple of his books. It's a pattern within biblical theology. Actually, Colton and I had a discussion how it's not just recently, where it's not as prevalent and systematic, but it wouldn't be by nature of its own thing.
Right.
But biblical theologians have begun to go, wait a second, there's some parallels here going on. And so that even in the time of Josephus writes, I wish I had this in my notes. It's something to the effect of, and if you really want, I can put it in here. He writes that the temple itself, and he's talking about Herod's temple, is a microcosm for the universe as a whole. And so that there's a connection between temple, where humanity meets God in a sacred place, and the physical reality, the cosmos itself.
Interesting. What does this have to do with the complementary idea?
Well, here's the thing. The temple obviously has ties to Eden, very strong. However, it also, but the same ties of, as Josh pointed out, dominion are large. But when you start to look at the context in which Genesis 1 is set in, and this is where I think Joel's going to more come in with John Walton's, his whole Lost World of Genesis 1. He goes over the extensive, there's a lot of literature where temples have a 7-day coronation in the ancient Near East. And that's a common pattern.
And so this setting up, it's as if chapter 1 sets up this idea of this coronation for chapter 2, which is thoroughly
they're still different, right? They're not chronology, but that they have a common theological through line,
right? Which isn't the alternate theory, the third one, which says that there's nothing similar, but this one says there's some pretty explicit
these are two different accounts. They don't mesh chronologically. There's some problems there, but the author has no issue putting them together, saying, "Hey, these two things are linked together in 2:4 in chapter 2 verse 4," these two things are linked together and they build off of one another. And so that at least what I'm presenting here, and I think if did you recently read Lost World of Genesis 1?
So is what you're saying is that Genesis 1 is the coronation day for the temple, and then Genesis 2 is the temple itself.
But not in the chronology sense, but just the thematic sense.
In a thematic sense, in a complementary.
I would argue a functional sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Eden is now functioning as the temple.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And then the creation of the temple, or you could even say the enthronement of God in his temple. Because here's the thing. You build the temple, everything comes together, and then the Spirit of God rests on it, right? And what does he do on the seventh day of his creation? He rests, right? He dwells, and then he starts to commune with man. Here's a thing, and I don't know if this is real or not, and I'm gonna run it past you, and we'll see what happens.
Okay.
Is the Garden of Eden the Ark of the Covenant?
The Garden of Eden is more akin
To the
in
Holy of
thematic
Holies.
is the Holy of Holies.
But here's the thing: in the Ark of the Covenant is the staff that is continuously blossoming, and the Ten Commandments. So the knowledge of good and evil, and the
Tree of life.
Tree of
the
Life.
Tree of Life.
I have not heard that connection. I'd have
Okay, 'cause
to
it just
think about
happened.
it.
It was just
I think it's more because it has more to do with God's presence. Out of God's presence,
Well-
the bountiful, the most bountiful region of creation is the rivers of life flow out of the. Sorry, what were you gonna say?
Oh, no, continue.
That is where the harmony is, right? In that humanity is, and more theologians are going to debate about this one, and I'm not even sure where I'm on with this one, is that humanity is meant to extend that garden outwards.
okay.
Sorry.
Can we play with that idea for a bit? Your Ark of the Covenant?
Yeah.
So, just...
Well, and cherubim defend it is the other thing.
Yeah.
Cool.
So you've got, you said God rests in the middle, in the garden, right? The story then is presented as God walks with Adam and Eve in the garden. In the fall narrative, it seems as like he comes in the cool of the day. It seems as if like he's partaking in whatever their life while he's there, the same way that he exists in the But then you mentioned that the Ark of the Covenant is in the middle of the most holy place, right? I got another idea, but I don't want to say it on the podcast because it's dangerous. So you've got, but in the middle of the garden is the two trees. So not that the garden is the ark, but the two trees in the middle is the Ark of the Covenant. But the reason why there's now, quote unquote, a box surrounding the ark, notice this, he says, don't touch the ark.
Yeah.
Right? The same way he says, don't eat of the
Tree of the knowledge of good and
tree
evil.
of the knowledge of good and evil. But Aaron,
If you do it, you shall surely die.
yeah, and if you touch the ark, you'll die. But Aaron was able to use the staff every once in a while. Early on, and then it was put into the box. In the same way that they were allowed to eat of the tree of life.
Interesting. I'd have to explore that.
Yeah.
This is a new idea.
Also, I've got another idea.
It's fine. Cut it there.
Okay, but the expansion of the outer ring. Okay,
Yeah.
you mentioned that just a second ago. Okay, you go.
Can I we'll get there. I do want to list, there's a couple other things to reason why Genesis 1 would also partake in that cosmic temple stuff.
Okay.
Like other ancient Near Eastern temple creation documents. Some are linked to cosmology. Not all are, but all of them list that, the icon of the god is put in last.
The icon, the idol, the image.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so obviously, the biblical image is not, these are actual gods, but it's doubling down on, that's the image, not the thing. But it is the last thing in.
When I wrote my paper on the image of God, which we should probably have a podcast all on just what the image of God itself means, kind of thing. When I wrote my paper on it, this idea did come up briefly, and I went, oh, this is a big topic that can't fit into my paper. But it is an interesting connection. Because the image of God can very easily be translated also as the idol of God, or the like you said, icon of God. This representation of the greater non-physical being in a physical way.
And so that's heavily tied to humanity having dominion over the earth, sharing in that sovereignty thing, which, as we mentioned, is already echoed in Genesis in the second creation account. Additionally, there's with that there's some priestly analogies, both with later Judaism, where they would view no, that's second account already, that cosmic temple building with that 6-day pattern, especially with that explicit 6-day pattern,
right,
where that humanity functions as priests, as intermediaries between the created order and the gods, normally as subjects, not as the actual text lifts them up to be, hey, you are like vice regents. There's even an emphasis on food normally, whereas like the first creation accounts, like, hey, the food's for you and the animals. That's it. Whereas normally other creation accounts will be, no, the food's for you to organize and bring to me.
Right. And that gets, you lightly mentioned it, but that gets into our next topic.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're going to go. But all I'm bringing up there is, yes, the later on, the tabernacle and the temple is meant to bring that. Oh, these are images of the garden. That this is, there's something correlated with the garden, whether the garden is the first temple or whether the temples are now new Edens.
Yes, that's what
theologians debate that. To be honest with you, I still have yet to study on that topic.
Yeah,
but the correlation there is really heavy, and whether that has more influence on what the temple is than what the garden functions as. They would see that the garden and the created order in Genesis 1, because both, as we've lightly demonstrated, have priestly and temple themes going on. Yeah. Well, that would be a through line through it, despite them being separate accounts.
Right.
But we've mentioned there's a couple like ancient Near Eastern motifs, stuff like that. Why have two accounts at all? Why not just one? And I think Josh is going to get into that idea of, well, they're polemics on different things.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So the polemic, let me look up the
definition.
The definition. Loosely, it is a polemic is a literary device from Greek and Middle Eastern literature, meaning so you have a political or religious or philosophical point, a text, and then somebody, the political opponent or the alternate religious group or whatever, will take that text, alter it slightly to make, and the differences there, whenever you see a difference between them, because they'll be similar, the differences are the points that the opponent is making. And it comes from the word meaning to attack someone or something. Polemic. And we've been using it for forever. America still uses them in their like political campaigns. They'll like release a commercial, and then you'll see the other guy release the exact same commercial.
Yeah,
but
with slightly things change.
I think Coke and Pepsi is the perfect example of this.
Yes.
They'll redo the exact same ad, but just swap logos.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And so, well, I thought this was the actual creation event. Like, this is original.
Genesis 1 and 2, you mean?
Genesis 1 and 2. I thought this was the original creation story. Well, potentially.
Careful.
Potentially.
This is when we get into the fun and disagreeable territory.
Yeah. It seems as though the stories are similar. The stories are similar to other creation stories.
Not just seems. Phraseology is almost identical.
Yeah.
The nods are consistent, and the polemic is easily identifiable, meaning it's intentional.
Joel, you mentioned that there was 5 specific, within the creation stories, there's 5 other texts that it seems like these 2 Genesis stories are taking from. And
you mean not the documentary? Yes, hypothesis. No, okay, I was going to say those aren't.
no, but you're right that there's 5.
That's what he was talking about. But is there 5 actually?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are
Pattern.
Yeah. So there is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story.
When I'm high.
Yes, when on high. In English, Enuma Elish means when on high. And then the Atrahasis epic. And they both, elements of those stories, phraseology, the pattern of events.
Do we have some examples of the phraseology?
We will get there.
Okay.
And then within Genesis 1, you have Egyptian stories. So Genesis 2 seems to be an amalgamation of Babylonian, Sumerian, Mesopotamian stories from that side of the planet. And then you have Genesis 1, which is a mix of 3 and a 4th Egyptian creation story. They had a bunch of them because of their city-state effect.
Yeah, they aren't consistent even in of themselves.
Well, they also use them as political, so it's not like we're doing a new thing either. Yeah.
Yeah. And Moses, having been trained in Egypt, may have learned something from them.
Definitely.
Well, would have.
Definitely.
Yeah, would have definitely. And so you have a thing called the Memphis creation story, the Heliopolis creation story, or the pyramid texts, and then you have the Hermopolis creation story, or the coffin texts, and then you have the Ogdode. And I'm gonna read some stuff if you're okay with that, just lightly.
Let's stick to summarizing for sure.
Yeah, I just want to read one.
I would like you to, if you can.
Because some of these are longer
just 2
than
lines.
Genesis.
Oh no, I'm just reading 2 lines.
Okay.
Yeah, just the phraseology similarities.
So, the Ogdode is 2 lines. This is it. And okay, the cosmos was undifferentiated formlessness, and darkness was over the surface of the primordial watery deep, and the divine wind of a tomb was over the primeval waters. That sounds a lot like Genesis 1.
Yeah.
So, Genesis 1 is, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
Do you think this was like the original DC and Marvel controversy? They're like so similar. And then people fight over them.
Yeah, Namor and Aquaman.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So, anyways, what's the point? What's the difference? Well, if it's a polemic, the difference there is that the names, first of all, Atum is an Egyptian god. It's one of many, whereas in the Genesis story, it's one god, and it's not the emphasis on the wind, even though the spirit and the wind are the same word in Hebrew. The emphasis is on spirit. So it's not just the wind. The god is this wind over. It's the spirit of this actual god is there. So you have that difference. The another part is the Egyptian creation story starts with on an occasion.
It just so happened.
Right?
Time exists before God creates it.
Yes. Whereas in the Genesis story, in the beginning, God created. So in this story, it's on an occasion, the deep and the wind are together. That there's no reference to time, like coming into existence or stuff. Whereas in Genesis 1, it opens with, in the beginning, God.
Everything.
Well, starts with...
God is immediately listed as the cause.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything that happens is his intention.
Yes.
It's not just, this happened. And if my memory's right, doesn't a tomb just self-actualize out of the deep?
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas God's just like, oh, no, that's the stuff I create the earth out of.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just here.
And isn't Memphis him creating something to stand on? Because he's just like...
So yeah, we'll get to that. So what you get is then, so you get, now you mix it with the Memphis story, and then you mix it with the others, and you get this pattern. This is where it gets freaky. So you have an in the beginning phrase, on an occasion, and then you have the Ogdo, the lifeless, chaotic, watery deep of Genesis 1, 2, there.
The cosmic soup.
The cosmic soup. And then you get a tomb, the divine wind is over the deep, and then he speaks and light appears. And that light is Ptah, the second god. So every time something is created, it's also the name of a god.
Yeah, it's a theogony, I think is what it's called.
Yeah, so you get light comes into existence as this being Ptah. And then he needs somewhere to stand because he's drowning in the deep. And so what he does is he separates the waters from the waters so he can breathe.
Wait, I've heard that line before.
Yeah. And then he creates dry ground and brings it together so that he has somewhere to stand. So he's not swimming, right? And then after the dry ground appears, he makes the sun, or he makes Ra. And then he sets him to rule the day. And then he competes with the whatever.
But in the biblical account, it's just like, yeah, sun, stars, moving on.
Yeah, we'll get to that. And then it's the earth sprouts vegetation, animals, birds, and reptiles, and then the idols of the image of the gods.
Right.
Yeah. So on the final day of creation, the images of the gods are made. Interesting. And then Ptah rests in satisfaction of his creation. And then humans aren't there.
Is it the same amount of days?
No, it's all one day.
Okay.
So it's one day, but it's the same order of events. So let's get into this. It's a polemic. What is God doing? The major one is it's one day. Now there's 7. It's a number of completion. God is finished creating in its entirety. After this, Ptah weeps because it's so beautiful, and then the tears mix with the dirt and it makes humans, and then they're like, we got these things and we don't know what to do with them.
Which is actually
Yeah.
a rather humanitarian view of how humans come to be in the ancient
Yeah, compared to the Enuma Elish, we'll get that. But it's Ptah is like, we gotta do something, blah blah blah. And so you get the 7 days versus the 1. It's specifically structured on God's behalf in the Bible to present not just your idea of this coronation, but its creation is complete. It's exactly as he wants
and
it.
it's good.
It's
good.
That's another
very
difference.
good.
And has the one preeminent who creates and is over and simply speaks it all.
Yes, you got the preeminent. You got the every single day he says
His command over it.
I speak that the thing comes into existence. Whereas Ptah
it just happens and then he does something about it.
and then he uses his power to do things. And then there's also a difference there with all of these things are gods. Whereas in the God's creation story, he's like, no, these are just things. Yeah. This is just a place, but for something else later. Yeah.
And here's what I found. I was trying to explain this concept to an older member of the church that didn't necessarily grow up knowing or caring about alternate texts that could be overlaid, whatever happened there. Mm-hmm. And the best way to understand it was, hey, you know how the Egyptians worship the sun and the moon? Yeah. Pretty common knowledge, right? Yeah. Well, isn't it special that God specifically says that he created the sun and the moon? Yeah. And that's all you need to say. And that's proof of a polemic. And it's not that controversial.
Yeah.
And
so if you're looking for practical application of this whole podcast, that's one of the things.
Yeah. And then that's it. So we're going to get into, there's more polemic devices, but we're going to talk about them more in depthly on the interpretation podcast.
Sure.
Because there's so much. We could spend an entire podcast on just polemics.
Okay. I think the plan.
Yeah.
We've established in this episode that these are 2 separate accounts. They shouldn't be read as entirely separate accounts.
Yeah.
There's problems reading them chronologically.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Hurt. Ow.
I should at least just give the intro for the Enuma Elish.
Please.
Yes. So you get into Genesis 2. Sorry. I was just focused on time.
It's okay.
I didn't want to give away all the surprises.
It's okay.
So the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, very different. Went on high. It opens with that. But Genesis 2 opens like this. When no bush of the field had yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground, and the mist was going up from the land, and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God had formed a man from the dust, the ground had breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature.
Right.
That's nice.
Yeah. Enuma Elish. When the heavens had not above did not exist, and the earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu, the first of Northern, and its begetter, and the demiurge, Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. They had mingled their waters before, the meadowed land, and coalesced, and the reed beds had been found, when not one of the gods had been formed, or had come into being, or when the destinies had been decreed, the gods had created them, Lam and Laham would be formed. So you've got, when all of this stuff had not happened yet, the gods created, and then these two beings. And then in Genesis, when all the fields and stuff had not come into being yet, God was there and created Adam and Eve.
And all the animals.
Yeah.
And the plants.
Yeah. And so, like, you've got this, the phraseology is the same. The pattern of events is the same. There's not just that, there's this female and male sub-god that worship and work and are created for the other gods. And then in Genesis, there's this female and male image of the god created
to be vice regents.
To be vice regents on behalf of the major god. And so, like, even themes are, like, kind of mixing there, but there's a difference. There's two gods, whereas God is saying, no, this is just what I'm doing. They have this, like, collaborative work where they have to work together, and then they don't get along. They're opposites. They're
in the Enuma
competing in the Enuma Elish, whereas God's unified. When no other gods had come into existence, it's like, no, just when he's in the process of creating, whereas they just kind of there, but God is found in the process of doing something. And then, so, like, he's got intention, they're reactionary.
Okay.
It's like they're just there, and then they're like,
they do stuff.
They do stuff.
There's God's preeminence.
Yeah.
Again,
intentional.
Yeah.
It also seems like it's how humans would create the world. Right? It's like kind of an accidental response to things going badly.
Yeah. Nature is its power
that's
of
a
its own.
censored version.
Oh,
Yes.
for sure. Well, it's actually surprising. I think it's a polemic in itself that the Bible's not more sexual than it is.
Well, no, and this is just one of the polemics later on. Marduk, after he defeats Tiamat, beats up her, cuts her in half, builds the sky out of one half of her body, builds the earth out of the other half, and then uses her blood, mixes it with dirt, and makes humans so that they can build temples for the gods so that he doesn't have to do anything.
So he can rest while they bring him food.
While they bring him food. Whereas in the Egyptian story, it's like, hey, we should take care of these things that spontaneously came into being because I started crying because of how beautiful everything is.
A lot nicer,
Yeah.
But still, nowhere even close to the biblical account.
No, hey, I'm making them like me, and I'm putting them in charge of this beautiful creation that I did for...
So that I can have a relationship with them.
Yeah.
So I can come in the cool of the day and just walk with them.
Yeah.
So...
And they're not an accident. They're the point of the creation. Anyways.
Yeah. But something interesting about this whole topic is that I think of the four of us, I accept this as a tentative theory more than the rest of you, whereas I think most of you accept it as harsh reality. Like, this is what the Bible is, where I'm like, I don't know. There's a lot of evidence for it, but I have trepidations.
Well, I think you're more in line with, let's say, the common Christian.
That's why I wanted to bring up, is that what does this mean for biblical inspiration as a whole, but specifically just like, how do we see interpretation? Just how do we interpret it? If it's not, what does the Word of God mean if it's from other sources that are explicitly not from the Word of God?
Can I give a New Testament example of this that more people know of? Sure. That's actually, the example is given in the text itself. When Paul speaks on Mars Hill, he talks to the philosophers there.
Right.
And he says, hey, you have this statue of this unknown God. And then he starts talking about it. He says, all the things you believe about this God are actually true about mine.
Yeah.
And then he quotes their poetry. And he says, you talk about this thing as if it lives and breathes in you and causes you to live. Right? And he says, yes, but about my God. Right. And so he's taking this text that's unrelated to the Bible and then presenting God's truth by altering it slightly and bringing them into this understanding of the biblical God.
Right.
And then that piece of text then becomes inspired because it's written in the Bible.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And that's something
Yeah.
I can accept. But what does it mean for creation if it's someone else writing it and not, like most people interpret it, the literal way that the world was created? Or at least a representation of how the world was actually created rather than just taking thematic structures. If it's purely thematic, is it actually creation?
So I think that the confusion is functional with material.
What do you mean?
I mean that it's not an account of material creation, but functional creation.
Again,
So-
that thematic idea, right?
I can read it completely literally, and it's still functional rather than material.
This is actually where Joel and I disagree on this, but
Yeah, no, and I might be the minority, holder of this view.
not in scholars.
Maybe not for scholars, but scholars, it's a million people can believe something and then it's finally represented, or one guy can believe it and then sells a bunch of books on it. It's like academia is kind of a hit or miss thing.
Well, it's an interesting way of putting it, but yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
So what part of I'm gonna grill you a little bit.
I'm not saying that this is necessarily what I believe, but this is a dump onto someone who, like, you're dumping a lot of things onto someone to accept as a baseline reality for them to be like, but I have questions, but I have problems. This is not how I was taught to read the Bible.
fair
That kind of
enough.
thing.
Yeah.
So yes, you can grill me and I'll try to represent it best I can.
Okay. What in Genesis chapter 1 do you see as 1 and 2 we'll say, do you see as a literal,
The fall of man. That's chapter 3.
so that's still,
There's a lot of issues if you take away a single person as being the
okay,
origin of
so that's
sin.
more the Adam and Eve controversy.
Yes.
Yeah, we can get there.
But then
we will get there in our podcast episodes. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to get too deep into it, but
Yeah.
this was something I wrote about in my paper a little bit.
Yeah, for sure, but let's stick to 1 and 2.
Sure.
Is it the 6 days or the 7
No,
day
I-
creation?
I think it's pretty reasonable to believe that's not a literal 6 days or 7 days
Okay.
of creation. I think there's a reasonable argument for it, one that I believe.
Is it the firmament?
No.
Okay. Well, that seems to be one of the only things that they believed was true about the world and wasn't a
Okay.
poetic structure.
Who?
The people who were writing it.
Right.
It was the Jewish understanding there was actually a firmament above the earth.
Can I give a quick cursory over ancient cosmology of like the structure of how that works?
Yeah, go
Because
for
some
it.
people might not know what the firmament is.
The firmament. It's the waters above and the waters below, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, it's just that imagine a flat coin,
Yeah.
but then held within the middle of a marble, and our existence is on that flat coin, and then
You'll hear
there's
a lot
a
of
little
flat
bu-
earthers talk about it.
yeah, it's Middle Earth actually.
It
From
is.
Lord of the
It
Rings.
is.
Are you? Oh, is what you're saying is that Earth is just a snow globe that got dropped off the boats that go on across the ocean that people like party on?
Boats.
No, cruises. So it's a.
Yeah, I don't know what it is.
Are you saying that Earth is just a snow globe that fell off a cruise ship and is now just sitting at the bottom of the Pacific?
I guess. Anyways,
So let's look at creation with less rotting shrimp. Okay. Cool.
either way, that there's chaotic potential waters above and below that
Right.
that
This-
chaos soup.
This is the order in
Yeah.
between it.
And that there's an ordered reality in between it. And the writers and original readers of Genesis would have interpreted it in that lens. So that when Joel says firmament, he's specifically talking about just the waters above.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
But why is that relevant? Because obviously that's not true.
Yeah.
There is no firmament.
Absolutely.
Right.
But
so
then
why
why
bring in
would
what
you-
the Jewish interpreted how?
Because they
creation-
wrote it.
Sure, but why does the
Was it just lies to them originally?
like how the thing
Like
what the firmament is?
no, if it's an account of material origins, and they would have understood material origins in their cosmological worldview with the firmament and the chaotic waters above and below, they would have understood it in that context, meaning it was written to explain that context.
Sure. Well, okay. Here, I'm gonna have to make the I agree with you. I agree.
Okay.
I'm trying to argue for this side. But,
No,
I'm
absolutely.
sorry that I
'cause we-
chose the worst thing for you to defend, but it's,
No, it's
one of
fine.
the ones that I have a problem with.
But with 7-day creation and like a literal creation, yeah, that's a big issue. That idea of the firmament. Is it talking about a literal firmament? How do you not believe that if you also believe in 7 days? Stuff like that. But in terms of a more old Earth general creation of it, it doesn't necessarily need to have those literal material ideas like that. That the creation account actually represents literal things that are perfectly literal in more general guidelines, ideas, and symbolic meanings of things that actually happened.
Okay, so when you say actually happened,
Like how creation exists and happened. It's just
so
not,
so the function or the material?
what do you mean by function and material? That's more of my
Okay, so
confusion.
this is what Walton gets into, and it's something that I've really liked. I've gone all over the spectrum on it for sure.
Okay.
Old Earth, young Earth,
I have
whatever.
too.
I
I have
completely
too.
reject that dichotomy, and I think it's a bad idea. I don't think choosing one or the other makes any sense. So the thing about function, we can cut this out if this goes badly, but here's what I'm going to say.
This is the interesting stuff. That's why we're talking about
That
creation.
sounds like a soundbite.
So, because of the scientific revolution, we now see things as material. So when you say actually happened, that means that there was a physical representation of that. Not even physical representation. There was a physical entity that existed in time that had to be that thing.
Yeah, a literal, yeah.
Okay, and in the same way that you can say the firmament is real or not real, whatever, the function of God separating the waters above from the waters below still exists. And I think that it is not
thematic
the
reasons,
intention of the writer to talk about material origins.
Right.
I don't think that he's talking about how dirt was created. Right? I don't think how he's even talking about how species were created. I don't think that's the case. And I'm not saying that evolution is a better idea for that. It's just whatever.
Sure.
Right? I just don't think it's the intention of the verse. So say what you will about a literal reading, but I don't think that literal reading is true to the text, true to our understanding, or true to the understanding of the original context.
Interesting, because yes, that is a point I've heard quite a bit. When you by function, you're meaning more of a thematic and trying to
Ontology.
present an idea.
So the
by
way it
ontology.
exists.
The role it plays in an ordered universe, not
I
necessarily
don't know if
just
that's ontology.
thematic.
Is it?
It is. That's
Role,
ontology.
not being? I thought ontology was a study of being.
The being expressed would be its role.
I see. I
Yeah.
see. Okay.
But you're leaning more towards teleological, where it's the
Right.
purpose. But I'm saying the actual being, the way it exists, not just its purpose.
I enjoy where that's going. Can I try to play middle ground for a second?
Sure. Because I'm a little confused what you mean. But
Joel is expressing, and I think this is what's going on here. Joel's expressing when he says function, he means that this is how these things are represented and work in an ordered reality.
okay.
And the expression of an ordered reality is very, very important in the ancient Near East, and especially
Yes.
when it's contrasted with the chaotic waters. And so,
Sure.
so you can say that there's you can say there's a theme there, but the reason why he separates that separates theme and function is because yes, the theme of ordered reality is important, but when he says function, it's that these things that he's talking about, right? Like time, let's say, created in day one, let's say, or the fish and all that kind of stuff. It's not just to match the theme. It's meant to. It's not talking about the material origins, but the function of that material being organized.
Right.
And so it's not. I think that's why Joel is having a difficulty with you just saying theme, because it's not just quite theme. Am I
think
onto
so.
something there?
Arguably, functionally, it is, but yeah. Like in terms of function of how we see the structure of Genesis 1 and 2, it would be almost purely framework or thematic, right? In that kind of look at it.
I think thematic has more to do with the vehicle of communication. So the way
Yes,
light is
yeah.
brought into existence, right? And that's cool, and it's awesome that it agrees with science right now.
Okay.
that light is one of the first things to go. But I don't think that's the intention of Scripture. So I don't think it's proper exegesis to have a... I think literal reading is also the wrong word for it. But to take the traditional literal reading.
Material view.
The material view that everything is like wow, I can't believe God created the mountains. No, he created the means by which the mountains are able to grow and expand. Or
right, okay, I
mountains
understand.
grow, wonderful. I don't know. Again, scientific inferences on the creation story. I'm going to cut out a significant portion of that probably. But we'll see.
Because that's interesting because I agree with that. I agree with that. I think that that the other view puts more weight into God revealing things to whoever wrote it, or putting the literal creation of, the material creation of the world through the writer some way, as it happened in maybe sequence or in actual events. I'm not saying that that's necessarily true, but the order does seem to, and yes, you're right. The current scientific hypothesis does seem to present something fairly similar to the actual creation account in terms of order. That's not really the argument I'm trying to go down, or one I would make in a large, serious, proving kind of sense. Just more one that I would say is interesting.
Okay, in my mind, when you say the traditional literal reading, that was what I thought you were going to go into.
Right.
Was
I understand
an apologist idea.
I really like it, that idea, but I don't think it's a very strong argument for it. In terms of, I think that the issue comes in how people see divine inspiration. That people tend to think God revealed to Moses the divine, how the world was created in whatever way, in some kind of material way. And then the reasons they give, again, are usually things like the fall of man, how that happened, like how do you reconcile that with old earth, whatever you want to say, or especially framework. But what do you think?
Can I jump in?
Go for it.
Okay. I think this gets back to our comments about chiastic structures or progressive parallelism. Part of the problem, this is something an old teacher, I don't even think it was at Summit, I think it was at like high school or whatever, said was, the Bible is written for you, but it's not written to you. And you have to understand the text. You have to understand it the way it was read by the people who received it. And in the same way that when I read Genesis 2 and 3, I don't see a chiasm. But when I read it like a Hebrew person would, the ones who received it, I see the chiastic structure.
Right.
And I think part of the problem is when the layman, even myself, read Genesis the way we all read Genesis today in the modern day, 3,500 years later, after it was potentially first appeared, we're reading it with our lens. And so we're doing a bit of unintentional eisegesis.
Oh, and I think even those of us in the camp that have tried to bring as much background and exegesis to it, bringing in different ancient Near Eastern motifs and other Hebrew, your Hebrew lexicon, I think we're still running that risk.
And I think part of the problem is what do we do with the issue of reading it materially, understanding that this is actually God trying to tell us how the earth was created, not the purpose of creation. Then when we're going into it, it's not a problem with how we understand creation. It's a problem of how we understand inspiration.
Well, that's what I brought up.
So I think like what you're saying is people don't understand. They think that they're going to get 6-day creation out of this.
Sure.
Or day-age theory or gap theory. And I think if you're going, I think the problem is then that we need to backtrack as a church and discuss inspiration, not creation. So that we can then talk about creation.
That becomes a way harder topic, though, divine inspiration, because that's fairly subjective. Not purely.
Subjective?
Yeah, as in how someone chooses to believe how inspiration works. Because it's not something very explicit. There are guidelines, obviously, within the Bible.
Well,
like it's very obvious that the Bible, that Jesus doesn't literally possess the person, become them for 10 minutes, write down everything, and they just disappear.
Yeah, and
But
we might have to wait for another podcast to talk about inspiration.
Absolutely. I think we're gonna have to just discuss inspiration. So, if I'm gonna try to wrap it up, and we'll end it here because we're over time.
If I can give one quick word to the idea, because I'm not saying that this is necessarily something I agree with. It's just I have so many problems with Genesis 1, 2, and 3 specifically and how interpretation works that I don't know what to believe necessarily. I tend, like Joel kind of said, I tend to lean towards old earth, framework, young earth, all of these different ideas, but I can't settle on one because another point has such strong arguments, at least in my opinion. One of the strong arguments that I hear, strong from my subjective point of view, is that why would God give us a telling of how the world was created that isn't true? That isn't an actual way that the world was created.
Well, then you get it, but we've just backdoored that interpretation thing.
I understand, but it is, at least in my opinion, it is an interesting, like, if there's no physical material truth to how the world was created in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, what does that mean? Like, is that something God would do? Is that something we should even interpret it as? Like, what does that mean? And I think that, I don't know, it's a pretty weighty thing in my eyes. I don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, we're gonna reconvene and do some more episodes on creation.
Because there's a lot here, as we've discussed.
There's a lot here, and it's being a problem just to end it here.
I know.
So if anybody actually has any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, there's going to be a couple of those.
Can't wait.
Leave it in the comments. Let us know. Send us an email. Visit the website. Talk to us. Engage in the dialogue, because that's what we're trying to do here. And hopefully you enjoyed the episode up to this far, and you may enjoy the next. We'll see you next week.